So let's get started. Today we will be hearing from David Morato, Senior Planner for the United States Army. David Morato is a former TDEM planner, HCEP instructor, ICS instructor who has supported multiple local and state level exercises and has also responded to incidents such as COVID-19 in New York and New Jersey as part of the DOD response in Hurricanes Harvey and Dorian. David is a senior non-commissioned officer for the U.S. Army, working as a senior planner. He has 19 years of military service, including 3 combat tours, 2 in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. He was a lead in establishing U.S. Army South Communications to understand disaster response capabilities with Central American partner nations, working with agencies including FEMA, US DEA, HHS, DHS, the Coast Guard, and the Department of State to design and implement engagement strategies and training. He has held his TEM since 2016, so thank you for that. Thank you, David. We'll let you take it over from here.
Thank you so much, sir. Just checking my volume. So good morning. So currently I'm assigned to U.S. Army North, and so today we'll be talking about Joint Task Force Civil Support and the Defense CBRN Response Force, or DCRF. The importance of knowing this is that the U.S. Army has a component that's that's centered around their ability to quickly deploy into a center. And with this COVID-19, it was identified that New York City needed to have a robust command and control structure, and it was part of the national strategy over the last 60 days. I say 60 days because it's important to note that that was the initial response as we and other nations identify how to combat this pandemic. Guidance and tactics will change over time, and you'll see some of that as we continue throughout the upcoming months. Next slide. So the example you see in front of you is the United States Geographical Combatant Commands. I start with this because US NORTHCOM was established in response to September 11th. US Northern Command has a dual mission to conduct homeland defense and civil support operations when directed by the President or the Secretary of Defense. Northern Command conducts DSCA or DSCA operations in accordance with the National Response Framework. By responding to requests for assistance from civil authorities, U.S. NORTHCOM identifies these requirements to conduct defense support to civil authority operations based on the natures of support that are requested by civil authorities and then approved by the Secretary of Defense. DSCA operations can request support from any one of our services, meaning that support could come from the Air Force, the Marines, the Navy, the Coast Guard, and they conduct these DSCA missions in accordance with other documents known as the DSCA Executive Order. This executive order allows to what's due is known as a request for force. Next slide. What you see here is an example of presidential declarations that have taken place from 2000 to 2007. I would like to note that it's important that we as emergency managers understand that words have meaning and power. And as such, it's important to understand the precise meaning of words and terms when used in a conversation or in our writings. The language of disaster and incidents is different from what military terminology is, and it is critical that we use plain language when working together. It is extremely important to understand this language when we as the DOD come to civilian first responders and incident commanders, and we can have the opportunity to collaborate and work together. So what we're going to do right now is go over a short description of disaster, and we're also going to go over the word incident as well as hazard. The term disaster, hazard, and incident have reached its current definitions through 2 sources. The first being September 11th, the second after September 11th. All these terminologies, both old and new, help emergency manager community to have a common language and understanding. Next slide. What you see is the federal response cycle and how we respond to natural disasters or major disasters, as I just described before. So the definitions such as major disaster, as defined by Title Code 42 of the U.S. Code, is described as any natural disaster. We know these as hurricanes, tornadoes, tidal wave, or tsunami. And they are determined by the president to cause sufficient damage of such magnitude that they warrant a major disaster assistance to support a state or local government. The National Response Framework simply defines it as a potential dangerous or harmful and often root cause of an unwanted outcome. Because that is so vague, the Army requires more specificity in their definitions, and therefore we develop the current structure that you see within our response to defense authorities. Next slide. Once an incident occurs, the National Operations Center receives notification from the media or any one of the disciplines or departments, whether it be the Department of Justice in law enforcement or Department of Homeland Defense. Therefore, monitoring the situation and observing how it escalates. Local responders are always the first to have the actions involved with these activities. When it exceeds their capability, you'll notice that it identifies mayors and city council officials, activate a local EOC, and develop some kind of situation report that goes to the governor's office. However, if it exceeds these capabilities, then it moves on to the National Operations Center for evaluation. At this time, the Incident Advisory Council will determine if it presents a national level threat. It is presented to the Secretary of Homeland Security, and at that point, the specialty agencies will begin to identify if there's a need to deploy. I say this because JTF-CS is one of those elements that has a charter to go support in a specific incident where they can go and support outside of that authority at the request of the president directly, and sometimes circumvents some of these steps, but it allows them to respond immediately within the appropriate timeline. So all events are governed by the Stafford Act and its declarations, which allow us to commit resources, federal resources, to respond to support any life-threatening disasters. Major disaster declarations is usually a response from a governor or a state, and the president then convenes it and orders it to be open the way for federal commitment of resources, including potential deployment of DOD personnel, is what we saw and what we continue to see here in the United States. When military units come to a disaster, they come in strong numbers. They come with discipline, as well as well-trained personnel with a fleet of vehicles ranging from surface craft, aircraft, high water vehicles, abilities to operate for long periods in an austere environment, and a solid logistics trained, as well as short range and long range communications. They even have an in-place strong command and control system. That being said, all this detailed planning, it's no wonder that the Department of Defense is usually asked to support these disasters. One of the key tenets that we often rely on and always know is that DOD will always be in support of the civil authorities. We will take our lead from the civil authorities, and this is the primary mission for which we often do not understand the constraints. The Homeland Response Force is comprised of 583 National Guard personnel. At the core, these HRFs are a chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear response capability that is similar to that of the Department of Defense construct. There are 17 of these force packages across the United States, and they also provide a command and control element, and there's 10 of them that are regionally aligned with the 10 FEMA regions. HRFs are hosted at their state level, and in the remaining states, they usually have a structure that is seen as you see here. The activities that they conduct are obviously search and extraction, decontamination, medical, and fatality search and recovery. The purpose of this slide is to explain the capability of these HRFs and to identify and understand that you'll notice that it is these characteristics that will help you know that they are always there to support any mass casualty decontamination and medical stabilization. As one of their primary tenets, there's no reason they were one of the elements chosen to provide command and control in the New York area during the initial response of COVID. The National Guard Bureau and their CBRN Response Force is comprised of these elements that we've been talking about, and that the HRF, and also known as the Civil Support Teams, or CSRP, their job again is to provide DOD life-saving capabilities that mitigate and impact major catastrophes and disasters. They have the responsibility to therefore respond and be ready within less than 6 hours notice of any major event. The civil support teams that you'll see are currently located around the United States. You can imagine the elements needed to converge on all these civil support teams scattered around the United States require a massive command and control system. This is one of the reasons that U.S. NORTHCOM established the JTF-CS, as they are senior level planners that are able to command and control all of these elements. I'll give you a moment to read this slide as we talk and we get on to the final portion of the JTF-CS. The national support teams, these are their locations. As I was saying, as I mentioned earlier, the national strategy is to have them arrayed around all 10 of the FEMA regions. U.S. NORTHCOM, again, as I said, has JTF-CS that can take control of any number of these and provide the command and control for them at any disaster. The JTF-CS is the nation's only active duty standing joint task force. It is comprised of not only active but reserve component service members from all disciplines: Navy, Air Force, Army, Marines. The headquarters includes an Air Force civilians and also contracted personnel. The JTF-CS is assigned to U.S. NORTHCOM and conducts CBRN response operations, planning, and preparedness to maximize all of the CSTS teams that are housed in the United States. The commander of U.S. Army North, here in San Antonio, Texas, is where JTF-CS has its headquarters. Often we ask, what is Defense Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Response Force? We ask, what is the DSRF? The DSRF, we have already learned, is one of the capabilities of the JTF-CS. But the purpose of the HRF is to provide the specific elements that are required to either a large scale or small scale event, encompassing up to a minimum of a half a football field to conduct its mission. The footprint will always depend on the size requested and the incident command site, the terrain available, and obvious the mission requirements set forth before them. This slide provides you an outlook on where the JTF-CS forces lie within the larger CBRN response capabilities of the United States. You'll notice Joint Task Force Civil Support anticipates, plans, and prepares for any CBRN response operations. Within the state, it culminates at the HRF, in which case they can no longer exceed their capacity and then lean on the federal response, which begins with the JTF-CS or the DSRF respectively. You'll notice on the far right, you see the 46th MP Command, which is dubbed the Cree Alpha, and the 76th Command, which is labeled the Cree Bravo. Each one of these forces conducts an annual exercise that vets them, that's called Vibrant Response here in the United States, or Ardent Sentry. Within the various training centers of the United States, it's housed by the FEMA region in order to conduct validating exercises to ensure that they are capable to be deployed in a no-notice event within the required timeframe. This slide, although busy, provides you an outlook of where the CBRN Response Force lies when looking at the United States. You have the Joint Task Force Civil Support, or JTF-CS. And in the incident management world, those of us that are emergency managers understand where the incident commander is. And when it goes beyond the scope of a normal incident, we develop what's known as the Unified Command. The Unified Command then goes beyond its capabilities, and we call in for assistance from regions or regional task forces. As you see to the far left, the State Emergency Operations Center are monitoring the activities throughout the duration of the event. Should it become necessary, JTF-CS, upon release from Army North, will go ahead and join and report to the Unified Commander and provide their capabilities to the civilian authority. The JTF-CS is made up of 4 specific task forces. which you see there. There's an operations, an aviation, a medical capability, and a logistics capability. During an event, the incident command is established. As we saw in the CBRN response forces begin to appear. The area command is established, and the state EOC is notified. The base support installation is identified, and that base support installation, the same as a ISB, is where all DOD forces will begin to flow into the area. The JTF-CS arrives with its tactical headquarters and has a forward element that immediately links with the area command. They establish their air points of arrival for any additional support equipment. This is where the remaining forces will fly in either with equipment or personnel. This should give you an idea or snapshot of how JTF-CS arrives on the scene. The Task Force Logistics capability and Task Force Aviation with their rotary wing aircraft can provide overflight capabilities or transport of key personnel. The task force log capability includes maintenance and supply support for up to 72 hours, depending on the mission, in order to process bulk water or fuel. JTF-CS medical capability also includes air and ground evacuation, as well as decontamination. What was used mostly during the COVID response was the JTF-CS medical capability, as well as hospitalization support and patient staging capabilities. This concludes the JTF-CS DSCRF portion of this brief. I'd like to go ahead and focus on now on this map you see before you, and you'll see the COVID pandemic response that took the United States. It's important to understand that not one sole area was affected, but rather the entire nation. In order to combat this disease in coordination with the President's disaster declaration, state governments either requested additional medical support or activated their National Guards to begin the command and control of these various operations in the states. You'll notice the map is already broken up, and you see Task Force West. This area was comprised and led by one of the CBRN Response Forces that has a 2-star headquarters, a 2-star general officer, and this was led by Task Force 76, as we saw in the previous structure. They were able to coordinate and maintain support for the state of California as well as Washington during the initial pandemic. The middle states are led by Joint Task Force 46. Task Force 46 was one of the CBRN response forces that had medical planning capability and decontamination forces that has taken care of the region of Michigan and Illinois, and was also responsible for coordinating in the Dallas area for the preparation of an acute care facility, and then deployed later to Louisiana. What you see here is the DOD response concept and how we first found our ways to challenge this virus and support FEMA. Initially, we tried what you'll see is the first option 3, which is a fully augmented element that sends both personnel and equipment. Upon realizing that the required footprint for this type of option or operation was completely outside the scope of most states to continue and support, we have now shifted to the option 1, which is now to embed staff augmentation that allows for credentialing and usage of medical personnel down at the specific hospital level. All of this is coordinated through a regional, in Texas, through the STRAC and through the Health and Human Services here in the state of Texas. This activity continues to happen currently in California, and also looks to begin upon request from the state governments happening in the Southeast. What I'd like to focus and highlight here is the protective equipment that's usually used by first responders at the hospitals and what the DOD requires. The key point for this slide, there's a takeaway, and they'll be available, is understanding that maintaining the discipline and the isolation that's needed in order to plan appropriately for the usage of personal protective equipment is always a challenge. So with many places, when you don't know exactly what your burn rate is, it's hard to predict how much you'll need if you don't know what you're going to go through. This was very challenging early on in the mission in New York because these calculations were still being developed as we understood this virus and how it spreads. Based on the dense population of the Eastern Seaboard, Northern Command determined that they would need to break up into 2 task forces. So they set one up in Florida as Task Force Southeast and one in New York City as Task Force Northeast. As the pandemic continued to take hold as part of the city, one task force was specified, and it quickly became to realize that the DOD was running out of ability to command and control for this dynamic change. It was identified they needed to have a 2-star headquarters. In this photo, you'll see the updates for that area. I'll start with the top left. That is the New York City Office of Emergency Management. As federal employees, as DOD employees in support to the federal authority, we often would come for our meetings and would operate in that operations center for a short time and then report back to a separate facility due to requirements for social distancing. One of the key highlights I thought was interesting from this time there is the fact that if anyone's ever been to New York City, is that you cannot park anywhere. Literally all the parking garages were shut down. So the New York Metro Police provided everyone this parking permit that you put your license plate on, and you had to have it displayed in your window because they were not allowing anyone any movement. Even with the stay-at-home order, you'd often see vehicles out. Well, they were ensuring that you were on official business by having this placard inside of your car. That's myself across the bridge in Brooklyn as I got ready for a meeting that was going to happen in the other side of the bay. I'll provide a quick organizational chart for this structure, and you'll notice that Northern Command sits at the very top of this chart, as we discussed early in the brief. Then you have the JFLC, or known as Army North, and you'll see that under there you have the West, the Central and West and Eastern Commands. So they provide the role of logistical support on this map, as shown in that previous organizational structure for this command. In this slide, I wanted to highlight the importance of logistics in this operation. As you notice, the warehouses that DOD provided and supported. In the top right, you'll see the acute care facility that was prepared to establish at the CenturyLink Center in Washington. And then moving over to the left side, you'll see the FEMA warehouse in what it looks like. As you can tell, their stockage levels are not very large, and for only an immediate influx into the area before the supply chain is established. In the lower quadrants, you see pictures of large containers that would either contain ventilators or potentially unit equipment as it was moved into the area. One of the more hardest portions of the New York mission was coordinating with the DMOR team and establishing these holding areas for all of the deceased New Yorkers. The challenge for this was not knowing what the burn rate of PPE would be for all of the first responders, or how we would continue to support and process what was being put upon the coroner's office for the city and state of New York. As you see here in this image, the need to coordinate operation and transport the assets identified in this map was not only executed by the New York National Guard, but by additional sustainment, or I should say logistic transport forces. As equipment was flown in from different regions around the country, it became important to establish a movement control to identify where trucks were going, where DOD medical providers were going, or civilian authorities, as items were requested from these warehouses. Here you see the slide that indicated the Federal Emergency Management Agency's incident command structure for the city of New York and their COVID response. I provide this to you to highlight the amount of coordination necessary between the various entities, and is something that is not new to most emergency manager, but I would ask you to look at the list of defense coordinating element, or the DCE, on your left. During this response, my job consisted of supporting as a senior non-commissioned officer in that liaison cell. And during this time, the JTF-CS had many challenges in understanding the situation, as it was unsure if it was going to get worse and how many forces should be supported while we were there. I would point out to the audience that the specific Department of Defense requirements must be outlined in those federal disaster declarations or those mission assignments. Here we show the breakdown of the JTF-CS and the Javits Center. You'll see the dual status commander, or the DSC JTF, and in there is where the military liaison sat inside the civilian structure for the city and the state of New York. The JTF-CS and their role as a two-star headquarters provided an integral part during this COVID response in New York. Understanding the capability of our federal partners, whether it be this DSRF or the HERF, and any of their capabilities, is important when collaborating during a disaster. The takeaway from today's brief is that understanding what your partners have, both at the federal and state level, can provide you additional input into your planning and preparedness. As there are many exercises that are held within FEMA, within our region here in Region 6, it's up to emergency managers to look out for local and regional participation. I encourage you to reach out to your regional representative or back to the state EOC in order to identify requirements or times when you can support. Thank you for your time, and this concludes my brief. I'll now begin questions.